Now, the honourable member for Guelph is rising on another point, I believe, a question of privilege also.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to reply to the government's response to the member from Scarborough Guildwood's question of privilege of February 17, 2011. By now you're quite familiar with the facts. My colleagues and I allege that on at least 4 separate occasions the CETA minister misled or attempted to mislead the House or its Foreign Affairs Committee in responses to inquiries about the KAIROS funding grant. For the sake of clarity and by example, on the April 23, 2010, Minister Oda tabled a signed reply to a Liberal order paper question in which she wrote, quote, "The CETA decision not to continue funding KAIROS was based on the overall assessment of the proposal, not on any single criterion," end quote. And later on, December 9, 2010, when asked if she knew who had written the "not" while testifying at the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, the minister responded that she did not know who had written the "not," yet later admitted that the "not" was inserted at her direction. On September 20, 2010, the minister tabled a signed reply to an order paper question submitted by the member for Notre-Dame de Grasse-Lachine, reaffirming that it was in fact an agency decision to cut KAIROS funding, contrary to her later admission that funding was in fact denied at her discretion. On this side of the House, we have been asking questions about KAIROS since November 2009. We now have 5 or 6 versions of the events put out by the Government of Canada. In defence of the minister, the government has advanced 4 lines of argument. 1, the opposition should have been more diligent in their questions. 2, the committee report makes no accusations. 3, CETA encompasses both officials and the minister responsible for CETA. And 4, bureaucratic and ministerial paper flow is not a work of art. In his first line of argument, the parliamentary secretary to the House Leader said in his statement to the House, and I'm quoting, "Perhaps the member should have asked different questions, or more questions, or have been more diligent in his inquiry, but his unhappiness with the answer is not a breach of privilege." Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not for want of trying. Since November 2009, the KAIROS funding has been the subject of 88 questions in the House, of which I've asked many, 6 statements by members, 4 order paper questions, 31 questions in committee, and 1 access to information inquiry. Perhaps the member from Scarborough Guildwood should have, and I quote, asked more questions or different questions or been more diligent. But does any reasonable person believe that the member from Scarborough Guildwood would have gotten a truthful response? What the parliamentary secretary to the House Leader is really saying is that it is permissible for ministers to be as evasive as possible in avoiding the truth. At some point, Mr. Speaker, there has to be a conclusion that the minister knowingly attempted to mislead members by suggesting that the decision to defund KAIROS was a CETA decision, a decision made by the very people who sat beside her in committee and testified that they had in fact endorsed KAIROS for the grant and had even recommended an increase in funding. Had we not confronted the minister and CETA officials at committee, and had we accepted the minister's answers in the House, we might well believe to this day that CETA had recommended against the grant. The second line of defense is, no direct accusation of any sort is contained in the body of the report. No contravention or any aspect of the law of privilege is enunciated. No person is accused of anything. There are no contradictions of fact. There are no incongruities in testimony, and no indication of what the other information before the House might be. There is nothing, he said. Mr. Speaker, it may be that the parliamentary secretary to the House Leader has misunderstood parliamentary procedure, or he has set up a faux argument to engage in spurious rhetoric. Either way, Mr. Speaker, parliamentary committees cannot make a prima facie finding of breach of a member's privilege. That is entirely your function and role. Therefore, a committee can only lay facts properly before you and suggest that there appears to be a possible breach of privilege. the parliamentary secretary to the House Leader appears to invite an accusation and seems disappointed that the committee didn't do so, knowing full well that it is not within a committee's power or mandate to draw such a conclusion. It has chosen to place the facts and circumstances before the House through a report. A finding of breach of privilege is a finding reserved specifically to you, the Speaker of the House. However, if the parliamentary secretary to the House Leader hasn't heard any accusations, then he hasn't been listening. We have laid out in precise detail the accusations and the support for such accusations that my and other colleagues' privileges had been breached. The third line of argument is that, quote, CETA encompasses both officials and the minister responsible for CETA, end quote. Some of the time, that may well be true. However, when the minister responded to the member from London North Centre's order paper question, she chose to distance herself from her officials and left the impression that the officials made the decision rather than her. She implied that the KAIROS grant did not meet CETA's standards. Again, in her response to the member from Notre-Dame de Grâce-Lachine's order paper question, the minister was quite clear. Les fonds ont été refusés récemment à KAIROS parce que l'agence a déterminé que la proposition de programme pour 2009 de KAIROS ne correspondait pas aux priorités du gouvernement. End quote. Finally, when her parliamentary secretary was speaking on her behalf, he stated, quote, CETA thoroughly analyzed KAIROS program proposal and determined, with regret, that it did not meet the agency's current priorities. This is important, end quote. She let that impression hang out there for months. Simply put, the minister had Parliament believe that she didn't fund KAIROS because CETA officials didn't want it to be funded. We now know that this is false, and that CETA officials wanted to fund KAIROS, and therefore it is clear that the minister was not speaking for CETA and herself, as the parliamentary secretary wants us to believe. Even the parliamentary secretary is now mangling words to recharacterize the minister's intent, when her intent was to mislead us into believing it was CETA's officials' decision and not her own. The fourth line of argument is that, quote, bureaucratic and ministerial paper flow is not a work of art, end quote. I agree, Mr. Speaker. Paper flow is not, nor does it have to be, a work of art. I would settle for accuracy and truthfulness. A reasonable person looking at the critical recommendation line might well conclude that all three signatories disapproved of the grant, when we know that 2 and possibly 3 approved of the grant, until a person, who the minister claims is unknown, inserted the now famous "not." It is clear that the minister did not intend that it might one day be made public. That part is clear. Neither the government nor the minister intended that this document see the light of day. And the reason for it being buried, Mr. Speaker, is that the minister and the government wanted you and I to believe that the officials made the decision to deny the grant. Therein lies the intent to mislead and deceive me, my colleagues, the press, KAIROS, and most disturbingly, Mr. Speaker, the Canadian public. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.